I'm going to go ahead and hit the record button, so the session will be recorded. My name is Jeff Warner. I'm currently the director of the contracts office here at the University of Central Florida. Previously, I served as the director of ancillary research agreements at the University of California, San Diego. I also spent about 12 years in the University of California system, working in different capacities as a research administrator. Today's luncheon discussion is going to be on master agreements with industry. The intent of the afternoon is an informal discussion regarding master agreements with industry, sharing advantages and disadvantages, best practices, and the future of master agreements at your institution. Are there any questions before we get started? I mentioned this previously, but it looks like the chat function is for the entire conference. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand utilizing the reactions button, or go ahead and just turn on your video and unmute. Again, this is intended to be an informal discussion. So if you have any comments or want to share any information, please feel free to unmute and we'll go ahead and discuss it. So getting into the discussion, we all know a master agreement is a contract between two parties that provides for multiple research projects to be funded under one agreement. The scope of work and any project-specific information are attached to a master agreement by way of a pre-negotiated task order. Master agreements expedite the processing of task orders. However, a master agreement requires a more comprehensive approach to negotiation, as the terms are needed to address a wide range of potential projects. Some of the advantages of a master agreement are, again, streamlining the processing of task orders. You're not negotiating terms and conditions for each project. You're setting a task order with the budget and the scope of work and processing that. So hopefully it expedites the facilitation of research. There's an advanced understanding of the terms for a sponsor. So if you have a faculty member that reaches out to you that's interested in working with a particular company, and you have a master agreement already established with that company, you understand what sort of terms and conditions have been agreed to. You can give the PI advance notice of what those terms and conditions are, what those requirements are, help them understand what they need to do to work with that company. Some of the disadvantages to a master agreement. There's challenges to negotiating terms that are appropriate for every project. As I mentioned before, a master agreement requires a more comprehensive approach to negotiation because you're trying to anticipate numerous projects under that master agreement. So it's challenging to negotiate those perfect terms for every project. A PI may not like the terms negotiated in a particular master agreement. So they actually may request that you use a standalone agreement, which could put the PI in an awkward position where they're wanting to use something separate from the agreement that's already been established between a company and the university. A master agreement may not always be used. I know that, in certain instances, no. So going to the question, I'm actually intending this to be an informal discussion. I'm going to go ahead and get to some questions here where we can discuss that as a group, but I did not have any slides for this discussion. So some of the disadvantages, again, is a master agreement may not be used. So I know that we've all been in that situation before where, maybe leadership is excited about working with a new company, and they want us to establish a master agreement with that company. However, that master agreement actually does not end up getting used, and there was a lot of effort that went into negotiation without really any positive outcomes. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up for a discussion amongst the group. Again, please feel free to turn off your video or unmute, raise your hand. So the first question that I have is, what are some of the advantages or disadvantages that you've encountered as a contracts officer when negotiating a master agreement? I know that as a contract officer myself, one of the biggest challenges that I have is, indemnification clauses. Indemnification clauses can be challenging depending on your state requirements, your institution's policies, and really understanding what the project is going to, what scopes of work are going to fall under the agreement. What's the risk? So we have intellectual property. Yes, and we'll get more into intellectual property later on. But intellectual property, again, is challenging. The unknown is the scope of the master agreement, what projects are going to fall under it. It's challenging to negotiate terms and conditions without knowing the scope of work. Data ownership and authorship issues. Data ownership is always a challenge when negotiating an agreement, making sure that you're able to protect the academic freedom for your faculty members, making sure that it's appropriate given contribution, what type of data is going to be exchanged, what type of data is going to be developed. Let's see here. I have a question here. What should we do when a company has agreed to a master agreement and now they want to change the proposal process that is spelled out in the contract? That's always a risk when negotiating a master agreement and working with a company that you have a master agreement with. One of the big things is that it's an efficiency gain when you work with a master agreement. You shouldn't be going back. You shouldn't be changing the terms and conditions. You've established them from the beginning, and you want to create an easy way for the university to work with that industry partner. Now, if they go back and they try to change the terms or change the process, that eliminates the benefit of a master agreement. And you're going back and you're negotiating each time. So in my experience, when a company has agreed to a master agreement and they want to change the proposal process or any other terms and conditions included in the contract, I want to understand why. Why has there been a change from when we executed the master agreement until now? Are there specific issues with a particular project that warrant that change? If not, is it just a change in policy of the company? And really stress to them, the benefit to the university and the benefit to your company is relying on these terms and conditions that we've negotiated. So if we don't rely on them, if we're looking to change them, please let us know why. That way we can adjust and understand if this is going to be something that is ongoing as we utilize this master agreement. Is it going to be something more of a standalone or a template that's subject to change each time? Does anyone have any other experience with companies when working with a master agreement, they want to change the terms and conditions or the proposal process?
Hey, this is Vicki over in Creole. We've had situations here where can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, just making sure. We've had situations over here in Creole where we have existing MRA, like I just said, and it's with a larger company, but then it doesn't get trickled down to the smaller departments in that company. So people are unaware of it, and then like I said, people want to change things on it and change how you propose and the IP fees and start doing all of this stuff. And yeah, I didn't understand what the real point of it was to even have the master research agreement at that point. It didn't really make much sense because we still submit regular proposals to them too. And by changing everything, it had to go through the whole thing again.
That's a great point, Vicki, and actually one of the questions that I had developed for the group. And one of the advantages of a master agreement is that you should understand how the company wants to work with the university because they've already established these terms and conditions. We understand what sort of requirements they have, what they're looking for in a scope of work or what they're looking for in a budget. But how is that communicated out to the campus? How are departments, how are PIs understanding what requirements there are or what opportunities there are to work with the company? And I wanted to bring to this group, are there any best practices? Is there any way that your university has found to communicate the existence of these master agreements, the requirement of these master agreements effectively to your faculty members, to your department research administrators? What are the best practices?
I'll speak again just because my voice is on here, but I wish just there was a list on OR's website of we have these master agreements with these companies, contact this person, this is who you should contact to inquire, to get more information about it. Just the list saying these are what we have. Because for the one that I'm talking about and I found out because the PI knew from working with the program manager at the company. So yeah, just the up-to-date listing of, hey, these are the ones that are actually out there and active that we can refer to. That would be helpful.
Are there any other institutions here on the line that have developed effective communication strategies for master agreements?
Hi, this is Loy Anderson, and I'm with Drexel University, but the experiences that I've had with uh, kind of triaging and getting the word out, if you will, to various parties that might be using um, the needing to use the master services agreement. I found that having a central contracting system that where everyone clearly understands that that is where they need to go to access, whether it's submittals and then that's kind of handled by the contracting administrator, or going to a particular place where, say, the archiving department to get all the um, the kind of underlying agreements before they move on to the ancillary agreements like the work orders or statements of work. That is one way that has proven effective in my previous life, if you will. So for instance, if they're submitting a statement of work to be reviewed, they are responsible to attach the master agreement that regulates that statement of work. So then, they have to do a little bit of homework. And then when we get it, we have to do some additional homework to make sure that they had the right document attached as the overarching agreement.
Thank you. Are there any other effective strategies for communicating the existence of master agreements and the requirements for submitting proposals that will fall under the master agreement? In my experience at previous institutions, communicating such as Vicky recommended, with a list of those agreements in place, coming from a large university system, there was actually a database that provided that information of existing master agreements with certain companies that was made available to individuals in contract offices or sponsor research offices, and even out to the department. It really is truly one of the benefits of having a master agreement is, understanding what you're signing up for when you're going to work with a company. There's a lot less unknown there when you look at the terms and conditions. What sort of intellectual property requirements they're going to be? What sort of upfront rights? What are they looking for? What's the proposal process? So effectively communicating the existence of a master agreement is one of the things I think that will highlight the benefit of having a master agreement. Right. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to other questions here. We have one about export control, ensuring that we're not overly limiting on work that doesn't apply to versus scopes that are bound by the regulations under the same master agreement. That's a great point, Tim. One of the things that we need to be careful with is that we're not overly restricting certain projects because we're negotiating so conservatively. We need to understand sort of how we can make it as broad as possible to have as many scopes of work under the master agreement, with the understanding that when there's a particular issue such as export control that may be applicable only to one of the scopes of work, we may need to address that in a task order. Now, I do go back and I say, one of the advantages of having a master agreement is not having to negotiate each time. But I think it's also important that you develop an understanding with the other party that there may be certain project-specific issues that need to be addressed in the task order. Something that was unknown, something associated with regulations, or maybe there might be even a change to regulations that you didn't contemplate in the original master agreement that now needs to be included. So it's important that you try to stick to the terms and conditions of the master agreement as much as you can. However, you need to have an understanding that something unforeseen may come up that needs to be addressed. And going back to Tam's point, making sure that you're not limiting work and not being too conservative in the master agreement so that it makes it ineffective. I have a comment here from Amanda. I get a lot of requests that look like this. Just send us your preferred language. We don't have a master agreement. I work for a hospital network. We don't yet have a master agreement templates, and our office legal affairs isn't keen on developing master agreements for contracting. In this scenario, would you recommend asking the industry partner to send over their draft contract, and then we can review edit language to align with our network? In my experience, starting with your institution's template is going to be the best approach. And why I say that is because you're starting with the preferred position of your institution. So starting with one of your templates in my experience, is going to expedite the negotiation process. If you start with the other party's template, obviously you're starting with their preferred position, and it's going to be getting them to the middle rather than getting you to the middle. So in my experience, developing templates for as many situations that you run into is helpful. That way you're ready to share something with another party that is a starting point, and you can communicate that. It may not be exactly what we're looking for here, but it's a starting point for us to initiate discussions. I would recommend working with your legal counsel or anyone else at your institution to develop templates. Advertising those templates are important as well, making sure that researchers and department research administrators understand that templates are available, and if there's a question from a company or even any sponsor, that they certainly can get a copy of those templates. Master agreements should have set timeframes of at most 5 years, so there's an opportunity to revisit those terms. I couldn't agree more. Master agreements that are in effect for a long period of time put the university at risk. We all know that research administration and research policies and regulations are changing all the time. So if there isn't an opportunity for the university and the company to revisit those terms, you could find yourself in a position where you're 6 or 7 years down the line and you're signing up for something that is completely counter to your university's position on risk or any sort of policy. One thing too, we're all working to get these contracts and these projects going as quickly as possible. And if you have a master agreement that's been in existence for a long time, and you have actually been successful in using it multiple times, one thing that could be lost is that, from in the beginning, there may be certain understandings. The contracts officer needs to get the PI on board with a certain issue in the contract, or, the department needs to sign off on certain risk or payment terms, or just document their understanding. And as it's used over and over again, some of that nuance may be lost. And that is something that could be prevented if it is revisited regularly. So making sure that you are going back and looking at your master agreements and understanding what the terms are, and not negotiating these master agreements that are in place for 10, 15 years. I'm going to go back up to my questions here. So the University of Central Florida has been looking at master agreements pretty closely over the last 8 months. We're looking at their effectiveness, how they're used, what we can do to create as much efficiency for the university as possible. So in looking at master agreements, we've been reaching out to colleagues at other universities, and I understand that at some institutions, there's actually certain criteria for a company to qualify for a master agreement. For example, there's an established relationship with the university and a proven payment history. There could be a certain threshold, 3 previous successful sponsored research agreements. Does your institution have any criteria for entering into a master agreement? If so, would you be willing to share that criteria with the group? So I can speak to some of the research that we found and some of my experience at previous institutions. Universities are looking at a way to make sure that the effort that goes into a master agreement pays out. And so in order to do that, they're looking at creating thresholds. We need to have a certain number of sponsored research agreements with a company before we'll consider setting up a master agreement. One thing too, that puts the university at risk. What if you set up this master agreement with a company that doesn't have a proven payment record with the university, and you enter into this master agreement, you're going along having all these task orders under a master agreement, and you run into a payment issue with the company and you didn't have any sort of proven history. So there is some benefits to having criteria for your university, making sure that you're not setting up a master agreement that actually puts the university at risk and is actually going to be utilized by the university. What are some of the benefits of having criteria for a master agreement? I touched on a couple of them in my comments there, making sure that there's a payment history, making sure that you're not putting the university at risk, making sure that the university is going to actually utilize the master agreement. Are there any other benefits that you can identify with establishing a criteria for master agreements? I'll go ahead and move on to the next one because I think I may have highlighted all the benefits of having a criteria there. When negotiating a master agreement it requires a more comprehensive approach as one needs to. Oh, I'm sorry, I've got a chat here. So this may be more pertinent to CTAs, but when there are some effective strategies that others have used when defining the roles and responsibilities of multiple parties within a master agreement. For example, CROs, sponsors, institution, PIs, healthcare facilities. So what are some effective strategies for defining roles and responsibilities for multiple parties within a master agreement? I think that's a great question. And again, something that is helpful for clinical trial agreements, but I think is applicable across the board, when looking at just standard sponsored research agreements. Defining roles and responsibilities within a contract can be challenging, and making sure that all the parties are on the same page. Not being too detailed to where you need to revise the agreement, in each instance that there's a change in roles or responsibilities, but being detailed enough to ensure that each party's on the same page. And in my experience negotiating a master agreement with a clinical sponsor, developing a roles and responsibilities matrix as an attachment to the master agreement is actually a really helpful exercise. It pulls it out from the body of the terms, so you're not having to sort of try to put it in a way where you're having it within the contract itself. It's an exhibit. If you want to go back and make changes to the roles and responsibilities matrix, it can be done easily within the tool itself, and then simply amended to the contract and replacing the original roles and responsibilities matrix. That's the approach I've taken in the past. You can break it down, especially when you have multiple parties, multiple columns, and getting into the nitty-gritty of who's responsible for what, making it a little bit easier on the back end if things change. Are there any other strategies that people have employed when you're looking at developing roles and responsibilities for multiple parties to a master agreement? So going back to my experience, when we were developing the roles and responsibilities matrix, it actually ended up being the most challenging part of the negotiation, because as part of the exercise, a lot came out that there was misunderstandings as to who was going to be taking responsibility for what part of the clinical trial. And it really brought to light a lot of issues that would have not been identified if we hadn't gone through that exercise. So it was really helpful. It got everyone on the same page, and actually led to a pretty successful clinical trial, at least from the administrative side, and there weren't any issues with the contract, and it went very smoothly. I'll go ahead and get into the next question. Again, when negotiating a master agreement, it requires a more comprehensive approach, as one needs to negotiate terms that potentially cover many different projects. You're looking at the terms and conditions to be as broad as possible if you're anticipating multiple scopes of work from different areas of campus. So negotiating a master agreement does not provide the same opportunity as a standalone agreement, in that you don't know the details, you don't have the scope of work, so you can't really negotiate the terms and conditions to be particular to a project. You have to think as broadly as possible. So what challenges have you faced when negotiating a master agreement? So when you're negotiating a master agreement, are you pushing to have the preferred position of your university, and are you holding a hard and fast line to negotiate those preferred positions? Or does your institution provide latitude when negotiating a master agreement? So I can speak to my experience as a contracts officer. I'm looking to negotiate with an unknown scope of work to be as broad and close to our preferred positions as possible. If I need to be more flexible, if I need to find a way to compromise with the other party that brings me closer to the middle, I'm going to be looking at what sort of informed participation do I need to have on the part of a faculty member looking to utilize a master agreement? Where is the master agreement going to deviate from our standard position, our standard processes, and making sure that I'm capturing that from the very beginning and putting the necessary internal controls in place to have the PI, the department, and any other effective stakeholders at the university informed prior to the start of a task order or scope of work. So you're really, again, trying to start with a preferred position, knowing that you don't have a clear understanding of who's going to be using it, what's going to be done underneath it. But we all know that a company's interests are Y and the university interests are X, and there's going to be a need to compromise. So making sure that you're documenting those compromises and identifying those affected parties at the university and making sure that they're informed once they utilize that master agreement or once they're interested in utilizing those master agreements. One of the ways that I've done that at previous institutions is informed participation letters. So developing a template, creating a file, making sure that the record is tracked accordingly. Any contracts officer looking to set up a task order underneath the contract already have that informed participation letter prepared, already have the terms and conditions identified. It's a matter of copying and pasting into the email, into the tool, whatever your university utilizes to document an understanding from a faculty member or a department, and making it as streamlined as possible, and making sure that the person who actually negotiated the master agreement is the one who's speaking to those issues, because I'm sure we can all agree that the person negotiating has the clearest understanding of the terms and conditions included in the master agreement. Are there any other strategies for negotiating master agreements and looking at finding the middle with another party? So I have a comment here in the chat. I've pressed for generalities in master for those particular for problematic clauses, compromising points, but add more clarity in the task orders denoting the order of precedence to superseding the master. I think Tam's point here about pressing for generalities in the master agreement, compromising points, but add more clarity in the task order is a great idea. One of the benefits of having a task order is that you can be more specific within the task order, and both parties could agree that the task order actually could be a place where you modify terms or add additional terms for a particular project should the circumstance warrant it. So I'm just looking at how we can approach it from different angles. One thing too that I've experienced actually pretty recently is that there was a master agreement, or I've worked on a master agreement that was for a particular area of campus. So while it was still not known at that time what sort of projects would be under it, it was for a specific area of campus. So it was a little more known what type of research would be conducted under it. And that was because the company was, primarily interested in working with that particular area. And so, they didn't anticipate working with any other areas. And so it was more interactive. I understood who I was going to be working with and the potential for research under that master agreement. We have another comment here. Since each project will be different, how do you determine the roles that should be included in the roles and responsibilities matrix for the master agreement? High level, you're going to try to be as high level as possible. You can understand that certain roles and responsibilities are going to be the same. So if you're looking at a clinical trial agreement, and let's say it's a PI initiated clinical trial agreement, and there's going to be an opportunity for sites to be issued under the university. Well, if you're looking at roles and responsibilities, you're going to have the university, if it's a PI initiated and they're taking lead on issuing those site agreements to the sites, that's going to be falling in their roles and responsibilities. But it depends on the situation, depends on the type of activities you anticipate under the master agreement. And if you have a challenge identifying those roles and responsibilities, trying to be as high level as possible with the understanding that it's going to be something developed further within the task orders or have to be amended in the future once projects are identified. Any other questions or comments about negotiating master agreements and potential challenges when the scope of work is unknown? So I think we're going to get into sort of the meat and potatoes of, publication restrictions. As a university, we're all looking to protect the academic freedom of our investigators and making sure that the students have the ability to publish and continue to utilize data or information developed in the performance of research or future research we want to share. And publication restrictions are something that we are going to avoid at all costs. And when working with a sponsor and working on a master agreement, agreeing to publication restrictions without actually understanding the scope of work is a difficult issue to rationalize as to why we would accept it. So, in certain instances, a publication restriction, is it something that needs to be included in the contract because of certain security requirements? Is it truly a publication restriction? Is it just a review of publication? I have a hard time believing that the company would have a valid argument to include a publication restriction in a master agreement because the scope of work hasn't been identified. We don't know if there's any sort of issues, on the security side, on the export control side, that would warrant such a restriction. So I think publication restrictions is one area that I would push heavily against. I really want to know why, if they're going to introduce a publication restriction, to why. And, if there's a valid reason, well, let's remain silent on the publication restriction within the master agreement. And if a task order comes up in a scope of work that truly has a export control concern or something that would warrant any sort of restriction or even detailed review of a publication, let's address it as a task order. Let's make it specific to that particular project. Let's not make it far reaching to every project. I have another comment here. I've seen both the master agreement and the work order cited as the precedent document in different instances. What should determine either position? So I think order of precedence is really what I'm looking for. Is I want the master agreement to be the foundation. I want the master agreement terms and conditions to be the starting point. The task order itself would be an opportunity to revise those terms and conditions for a particular scope of work. So if there's, if you're looking at conflict between the terms included in the master agreement, the conflict of the terms included in a task order, I would argue that if you want the task order to be specific to a particular project, for that particular project, if there are any differences in the task order and the master agreement, the terms and conditions in the task order would govern. Does that answer your question? Again, I think there are a lot of benefits to having an understanding of some flexibility, but you want to be very careful that the sponsor doesn't see the task order as an opportunity to reopen issues that were already addressed in the master agreement. And that gets us into the next topic, intellectual property included in a master agreement. We negotiate intellectual property terms in, almost every one of our contracts. And, a lot of that negotiation is particular to what is going to be conducted under that agreement. What sort of activities? Is this research? Is this training? Is this getting more into the service realm? Each of those issues are going to drive what sort of intellectual property terms you're going to include in a contract. I mean, I know that we all agree, it's a yours, mine, and ours approach when you're working with a university. Whatever we develop, we're going to own. Whatever you develop, you're going to own. Whatever we develop is going to be jointly owned, and ownership is going to be, inventorship is going to be determined in accordance with U.S. patent law. However, we know that there's going to be some particulars, some issues that come up that are associated with a particular project, some upfront rights, access, and depending on your institution, you may actually have an industry options program where the company can pay an upfront fee to get additional rights and exclusive license and non-exclusive license, just depending on the position of your university. Now with intellectual property terms included in a master agreement, what's challenging there is that you do not have the project to help drive those intellectual property terms. So you're going to be really negotiating to get the best position possible within that master agreement. You're going to be trying to protect university intellectual property, protect the rights of the inventor, make sure that the royalty distribution is in accordance with university policy. But what happens if you are unable to get that best position or those best practices? I talked about this before, informed participation, making sure that all the university stakeholders are aware, making sure that there's communications out to faculty members that are interested in utilizing that master agreement. Are there any other effective approaches to managing intellectual property when you're unable to get those ideal terms and conditions for your university? For me, I think it's communication. I mean, the starting point with intellectual property terms for a master agreement is communication. We want to make sure that we're communicating to our partners in the technology and transfer office. We want to make sure they understand sort of what we've been able to negotiate so far, what challenges we're facing, and how we can manage it on both sides. And then, going back to Vicky's comments about communicating, that's another thing that we should be communicating. If we're making, information available to our faculty members about the existence of certain agreements, they should also understand what sort of obligations they're going to be signing up for in those master agreements. And in thinking about industry options, such as those upfront licenses or those rights that you're guaranteeing, or in some circumstances, universities are actually offering ownership of intellectual property for an upfront fee. Master agreements are a little bit different. You can do that from the beginning with a sponsored research agreement because you have the faculty member identified. You can get their buy-in from the very beginning. If you negotiate a master agreement with intellectual property rights going to the sponsor, you may actually put the faculty member interested in utilizing that master agreement in a difficult position. They may be uninterested in licensing their intellectual property to this company. They may think that they have very valuable intellectual property that could come out of this agreement. They don't want to give up their rights as an inventor. And then you're now having to go back to the sponsor and say, I know that we have this master agreement in place. I know these are the terms and conditions that we've previously agreed to, but for this particular project, we don't want to agree to these intellectual property terms. That can put your faculty member in a difficult position with an interested party that want to work with. How are we managing that communication to the other party? Does anyone here have any sort of effective communication strategies that they've used when they found themselves in that position? I can say I've found myself in that position about, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. We negotiated some intellectual property rights that went back to a sponsor within a master agreement. We were unable to get the university's preferred position. And so it was one of those things that, we were nervous going into it, but understood that it was in the institution's interest to set up this master agreement with the company. We put all the internal controls in place. There was a lot of awareness about what requirements were associated with this particular company. Yet we had a faculty member who, was really interested in making sure that the university protected the IP. It was going to be very valuable, or at least that was their understanding coming out of the research. And so they did not want to use the master agreement. And they came to the contracts office and said, we can't use the master agreement for this particular project due to the nature of the scope of work. And, I had to go back to the sponsor and say, we can approach this 2 different ways. Can we negotiate, a task order that, removes the intellectual property terms from the master agreement and replaces them with, negotiated ones for this particular project? Or do we want to set up a standalone agreement? And the way that I approached it to avoid putting a faculty member in a difficult position is I took the blame. I said, based on the scope of work, based on, what potential results we have from this project, as a contract officer and an authorized official for the university, I am unable to agree to these terms and conditions for this particular project. So I took the blunt of that sort of discussion and the contention from the sponsor. They did not want to negotiate intellectual property terms, but after multiple phone calls and discussions, we were able to successfully negotiate intellectual property terms specific to the particular project. After explaining to them, giving them background and understanding why. And that, I think, is an important piece there, is explaining why. Why isn't something going to work for a particular project if we've already negotiated a master agreement? Got a comment here in the chat. To Mr. Warner's point, communication with all parties. Ask the PI what they want to do prior to negotiations to determine feasibility, then bring everyone together to discuss. Great suggestion. One of the things, too, that could be helpful with a master agreement is that when there's a project that we identify as potentially falling under it, a kickoff meeting. Can we get the sponsor together? Can we get the faculty member together? Have a kickoff meeting, understanding, and even before that, just an internal kickoff meeting. Get the department, the PI, the contracts officer, go through, make sure they understand, what terms and conditions there are, opportunity to ask any questions. That could actually make the process much more efficient, much more easier for everyone, and ensuring everyone's on the same page. If it's not feasible, let's start with something else from the very beginning. Nothing is worse as a contracts officer as getting halfway through a negotiation and realizing, I wish I would have done something different from the very beginning. I wish I would have, negotiated a separate agreement because this is getting too complicated. And maybe a conversation with the PI and or sponsor would have prevented this from occurring, 2 months down the line. Yeah. Key is communication by phone, conversation followed by email to confirm conversation so that all parties are on the same page. Absolutely. You know, in my experience, the easiest thing to do is just have a conversation from the beginning. Have a phone call, talk through some of the challenges, what I refer to as coming to a conceptual agreement on the concerns and issues that need to be addressed by both parties. And if you have that conceptual agreement, I think the language is much easier to follow. I think also with the master agreement, you're going to have a much easier time getting that task order set up if everyone is on the same page and they understand the requirements of both parties. So communication and following up with email, making sure it's documented, making sure that that conversation you had is referenced in the future. Question here, would you include a post-award administrator included in that kickoff meeting? I think it depends. That's a response to a lot of questions in research administration. It depends. If a master agreement includes ideal payment terms and conditions, is there value for having a post-award person included in that kickoff meeting? Is there going to be special requirements, invoicing documentation that's going to be included? Then absolutely. If you're going to be, there's any downstream effects on, a post-award administrator, financial within the department, you want to make sure that they're, at the table. One of the key things when you're negotiating a master agreement, you're coming to the end is identifying those key stakeholders that need to be made aware once a task order is issued and once it's executed. There are particular terms and conditions that affect an area of campus. They need to be made aware that that task order is being issued or that scope of work is going to fall under the master agreement. Any other questions so far? All right. This is a question still within the intellectual property rights arena. And again, I mentioned that the University of Central Florida is looking at master agreements pretty closely. If your institution has an industry options program, are those industry options, upfront rights, something that you can include in a master research agreement? I'm asking this question to the group because I'm genuinely curious to know if there's institutions out there that offer a master research agreement with a company where those upfront rights are available for an IP fee. And if you're uncomfortable responding in this group, I would greatly appreciate any outreach after the discussion if you have some information to share. One of the benefits of being able to host something like this discussion is, I really want to understand how other institutions are handling master agreements. I think it's one of those areas where, university leadership looks at them as a tool to efficiently work with industry, but there's some challenges with master agreements and making sure that they're effective. So in getting into some of the disadvantages to a master agreement, a lot of resources that are devoted to setting up a master agreement. They're one of the more challenging contracts to negotiate because, again, you don't have a specific scope of work in front of you to help you understand what terms and conditions are appropriate. It's a lot of resources. Usually it's a pretty high level of negotiation because there's maybe some political pressure on campus or interest in developing a partnership with an important industry partner. Now, how can we make sure that those efforts put into negotiating a contract and getting set up are going to pay dividends for the university? Sort of what approaches does your institution take to ensuring that a master agreement is used in the future? Now, this overlaps with a number of areas that we talked about previously on this call in that, looking at the effectiveness of a master agreement. So is there a proven relationship with this company? If there's not a proven relationship with this company, how do we truly know that that company is going to continue to want to work with the university? One thing I've seen at previous institutions is that for the contracts office to work on a master agreement, the company actually has to have a funded project. So we wouldn't work on a master agreement unless there was an actual scope of work or task order or a particular PI and even a dollar amount committed by the other party before we would start working on that master agreement. I've got a comment here in the chat. We've had issues with a sponsor wanting a master agreement, but then they don't follow it and then they want to renegotiate. If they weren't such a big sponsor, I could see walking away from it. Are there some best practices in trying to stick with the initial agreement, or should it be used in the renegotiation? Um, it's a challenging question, and I see this as a challenging question because there are a lot of times where a master agreement is being negotiated with a company because leadership on campus views them as an important partner to the university, or views them, they're located close to the university, they're in the community, or they have a high profile nationally, and we want to make sure that there's an established partnership with that company. And it's true, in effectively negotiating a master agreement that's going to be used, you really have to understand, what are the needs of the other party? What are the needs of the university? Because if you negotiate an agreement that's too lopsided, you're going to find a situation that you could find yourself like Marcus, where they want to go back and renegotiate. So we're not only looking at, the benefits to the university, but are there benefits to the company? Because if the company is not receiving benefits from the master agreement, why would they want to use it? One thing too that I've experienced in my career is that you negotiate a master agreement with certain leadership at a company. That leadership changes very quickly. Those benefits that you thought you were providing the company for funding the university are no longer viewed as benefits, and you're back to the negotiation table because that leadership changed. So what are some best practices to sticking to the initial agreement, or looking at renegotiating? I would say sticking to the initial agreement, we want to establish something that's mutually beneficial. Again, something that's going to be what both parties want. If we negotiate something where too much is going to the other party, we're going to find ourselves in a situation, where the PI doesn't want to use it. We're going to, having to communicate to them that we want to renegotiate. Or if we negotiate too far on our side and there are no benefits to the company utilizing the master agreement, they're going to come back to us and say, no, this is a standalone. This is something different. We need to negotiate a separate agreement. And you're asking yourself, well, why did I spend 5 months, negotiating this master agreement if 2 months from now they're going to want to utilize something completely different? So it's a balance, making sure that there's a balance between the interests of the university and the interests of the company. That way, that time and resource that went into negotiating actually is beneficial to the university. So it's helpful to the negotiation adoption process, has been collaborating with internal stakeholders to garner their motivation, use goals, plans, and align them with institutional goals and sponsor goals. Absolutely. Aligning the vision of the program. Maybe it's not just like a master agreement where you're going to have a variety of different sponsored projects underneath it. Maybe it's a particular program. Maybe the company is interested, in setting up a center on campus, or the department's interested in setting up a center. Finding a way to align the goals and the plans for the program as much as possible is going to allow both parties to want to use it. I think starting from the very beginning, making sure those stakeholders have a voice at the table. I know I mentioned this, that working on a master agreement for a particular area of an institution. Well, if you're working on that master agreement and you have a particular area of the institution identified, is there any opportunity to make sure that they're on board with the terms and conditions? Can they, help you in any way? Or, if it's just a standard master agreement, what potential stakeholders could you identify? Or what experience have you had with this sponsor in the past? Who's worked with the sponsor if you have a history with them? Maybe that's an indicator of potential projects in the future. I think looking back at history, communicating with interested groups will really help make sure that the sponsor and the institution are happy with what we've agreed to. And it's something that we can use as a tool, and not something that, we forget about, or, we end up renegotiating multiple times in the future. Going along this sort of theme, does your institution or any of the institutions here measure the effectiveness of a master agreement? Is it a metric that it's being tracked to document the value of the time that went into negotiating and setting up that master agreement? Are there any metrics that are used as learning opportunities? How many times you renegotiated? How many times a task order included different terms and conditions? is your institution going back and analyzing your experience with master agreements to develop a more effective approach in the future? So in my experience, there's a couple of different approaches that you can take to measuring the effectiveness of a master agreement. Now, it's hard. Measuring the effectiveness of anything is hard because once you get something set up, you tend to set it up and forget it. You've got 800 other things going on in your career and you're working on different projects, working on different agreements and going back and looking at historical data or the effectiveness of a master agreement isn't something that is typically a high priority, but it really is something that could be beneficial if you're looking at improving your approach to partnering with industry. So one thing you can do is you can look back at, all of your master agreements and identify how many task orders were funded under it. What was the dollar amount funded under it? What sort of renegotiations or specific terms and conditions were included in the task order? It's a very involved analysis, but if you're looking at, the future of master agreements at your institution could help drive the conversation. It takes a pretty comprehensive electronic research administration to be able to system to be able to do it. Going back to some of the comments previously on this call, being able to track these, being able to identify them, it's important. Creating transparency, but it's also important for reporting and looking back at what you've done with a particular company. Is our master agreements that efficient tool? Is it something that you should be pushing for more with sponsors, or really is it something that you're spending time renegotiating anyway? Then why would you do so? You can look at master agreements. So let's say your master agreement was set up for 5 years. Pull the number of task orders that you have under that master agreement and compare them to how many sponsor research agreements do you have with that same company in that same time period. One thing too that I realize now in discussing this, we talk about master agreements in a way that they're all financial, and there could be an opportunity to negotiate non-financial master agreements, a master confidentiality agreement, creating different disclosures under a confidential agreement, or you could look at a master material transfer agreement. So different ways, different tools. If you go back and you analyze the data that you have, you can understand the effectiveness. I know that we're coming up on time. We have 3 minutes left. Let me go quickly to the comments. Ensuring that our periodic reports and central system have attribution codes for the various identified benefits, amount of funding, students involved in research, outcomes in research. Absolutely. Any sort of benefits to the university, if you can track them in the system and be able to report on them automatically, oh my gosh, it's going to be really helpful for you to understand what you should be doing in the future to have effective master agreements. I appreciate everyone joining me this afternoon.